Hello and welcome to another session of Application Development Today. My name is Don Jackson. I'm your host. I'm also a Chief Technologist here at OpenText. And with me today, I'm pleased to welcome Mr. Mason Henry. Mason and I have been working together since probably 2017, where he was actually my mentor when I came into the pre-sales organization here at what's now OpenText. Formed a good relationship. Mason, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, certainly. Let's go ahead and level set that we're gonna use that term mentor very lightly in this scenario with Don and your background. But yeah, so as Don mentioned, my name's Mason Henry. I started it back when we were HP in about 2012. So made it through the progression of HP, HPE, Micro Focus, and now OpenText, all working with our ADM or Application Delivery Management solutions in a couple of different roles, but now today as a pre-sales solution architect in our what we would call our North America functional testing practice lead.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for coming on, Mason. I know it's a little bit of a challenge sometimes to get on camera and be in these type of meetings. So thanks for dedicating the time today. Appreciate it. Today's session is going to be about testing away your risk. So what are we talking about when we're talking about risk, and how do we test it away? What are going to be the impacts of stuff like that? So Mason, let's just jump right in. So how do you identify risk in today's applications?
Yep. So I think it's helpful to have some sort of system or method of categorizing that risk. So a simple, easy way to think about that, very concise. And there's a bunch of charts and little images and graphs out there that exist, but it's to be able to say, okay, what types of risk are there? So risk in its simplest form can be categorized with impact and probability. So you have risk that is high impact, high probability, as in it's going to impact a lot of things or a lot of important things, and the probability of that risk occurring or actually happening is high. There's high impact, low probability, low impact, and variations of that in between. So I think that's the simplest way to think about it: is what's the impact of that risk and what's the probability of that risk as well. Obviously, that can get a little more granular, especially given the industry that you're in. So there's tons of different types of risk. There's technical risk. Technical risk being, this is highly technical when we're talking about software development. It's a very integral part of our application or our system. So the things that it's going to impact from a technical standpoint is broad. But there's tons of other types of risk. Obviously, there's security risk, there's legal risk, and that risk is different across every industry. Obviously, risk is going to look different for pharma than it is for financial, than it is for transportation, for energy, for tech. And obviously, all of those experience risk in different ways, which I think is, from a software development standpoint, which is why people like you and I have jobs at OpenText to be able to work with software that helps reduce that risk.
So how do you go about identifying that risk? So you talked about categorization of that risk, but how do you actually identify that risk?
So again, that can be big based on industry. So I think obviously we start with what are the regulations that are in place. Obviously, from a pharma standpoint, that's FDA regulations. From a healthcare standpoint, there's HIPAA. So obviously, you want to start with what are the big regulations that are actually in place, and let's assess our risk there. Obviously, if you're in a very unregulated industry, that becomes much more, potentially subjective. So it is that sort of knowledge within the teams of what's risk, what is risk, how do we want to define risk. That can have a financial impact, that can have a technical impact. So I think that, it's a tough question to answer because it's so different based on what company you're with,
Sure.
what industry you're in. But certainly starts with the, what are the regulations, and then goes into kind of back to that, how I initially answered that, of what's the things that are going to have the biggest impact and what are the things that are going to have the highest probability of happening or breaking.
And what would you say then are common then, because we talked about different industries, what do you think are common risk factors in software development then? Other than, putting me on a project, which would be a huge risk factor.
It would be putting me it would be putting me on a project. But risk factors in software development, I mean, you think about especially the companies that we work with at OpenText. These are massive companies with thousands of employees spread all across the world that have not just one or two applications, but have applications and infrastructure and regulations that are distributed, that are both legacy technologies that have been around for 40 years, as well as brand new microservices, cloud native, SaaS applications that are all in some ways need to be connected, at least have data being shared between them, if not completely dependent on each other. So just the sheer size of what it takes from a technology standpoint to run today's companies inputs so much risk into that process, because especially if things, when it comes to documentation, right? We're people, we're human, we're imperfect. So we're going to introduce risk ourselves because we're going to overlook things. We're not going to pay attention to things, even, regardless of how well things are documented or how well we know things, we're still going to mess things up. So there's a size impact to that. There's a human element impact to that. And technology is not perfect either, right? Servers go down. Application code, right? Developers write bad code. Code just doesn't work for some reasons. Like there's infinite amounts of points of risk when it comes to technology and software development.
So what I heard is you pointed out a big area of integration risk, right? There's a risk when you integrate these large systems together, whether it's they're sharing data, whether it's input-output data, or they're actually sharing common data, maybe they're consuming data, a lot of data risks I heard in there as well. And I think another one that you didn't bring up that I think is one that frequently gets overlooked is Mother Nature data, Mother Nature risks, right? So you think about the concept of high resilience applications. Well, one of the things that you have to account for is disasters, right? So, as we are in the hurricane season for North America, if your data center is in a high risk hurricane area, you really need to make sure that you have a disaster recovery and probably a hot backup somewhere else in the country or potentially outside of the country that you don't have that, so taking into account that Mother Nature risk as well. So you talked
Absolutely.
a lot about humans and how humans introduce risk. So how are the computers or AI changing how we identify risk and mitigate risk?
So great question. And the general answer is, well, AI is changing everything. There's not one thing out there that is not impacted from a change standpoint with AI. I was
that
talking
would be why on every one of these sessions, there's always an AI question. For those of you who are planning to be featured guests in the future, be prepared. I'm gonna ask about AI. I can't imagine why, right?
Yep. Just the other week we had our CEO talking with one of the forefront pioneers in AI and talking about general intelligence and is it coming? Generally speaking, the people in that industry that are the experts say yes, one day that's coming. But even just talking with my father-in-law, he's actually right out in the living room outside my office here playing with my kids. So he lives in Arkansas, and something that they do in the state of Arkansas at the public universities is once you're 60 plus, that tuition's free. So he's retired and he went back to school. So he went back, he got his econ degree, graduated summa cum laude, and now he's just a couple of semesters away from a computer science degree too. But what we were talking about is how AI has completely changed the classroom. And it's not just using things like ChatGPT and Quizlet to get answers or write papers or things like that. It's also how it's changed behavior in students, right? It's not just using ChatGPT and Quizlet. It's knowing how to use ChatGPT and Quizlet. What are the prompts that you need to use? What are the ways that you can get around being caught for using those things? So it's again, it's not just
because in school that's called plagiarism. Right. In business, that's called working smart and read, right?
That's efficiency, right?
That's right. That's being efficient.
But it's changed everything as far as how papers are written, how tests are given out, how critical thinking is impacted within the classroom. So it really brings up some interesting things on that front to say, I'm interested to see what this next generation looks like coming into the workforce, with things like that being the norm, right? Yeah. Having access to that as the norm. It's just a given, right? It's a commodity almost at this point of having services like that. So, but when it comes to software development and assessing risk, I think it's really important that we start using those concepts of AI, right? Even just the basic concepts of AI is that I have inputs, I have sensors that intake data, that recognize patterns and make decisions based off of those patterns, whether we either allow that to be, passive learning or sort of hands-on. We train it, our AI, to be able to understand those patterns. But from a risk standpoint in software development I think that starts with data, obviously. And there's so much data across so many different systems that's distributed. So I think there's a lot of importance in bringing that data together to be able to have a consistent data set, to be able to analyze and make decisions off that. And then, let's start to make recommendations on risk, right? So that can come in the form of, we'll call risky commits, right? So from a software development standpoint let's go ahead and flag changes to code or changes to our application that are related to, say a lot of defects. So if there's a change that's being made that is related to things that are already broken, we want to be able to flag that and say, look, this is risky because there's already a lot of things that are broken related to this. Or if it's changes to certain or specific files that we see consistently are the cause of the build failing, or even just changes that are recent, right? So the most recent changes, all of those things we can flag as sort of what we would call a risky commit. But I think it's not just where AI really comes in, is not just saying, hey, this is risky, but it's saying this is why it's risky. This is the impact of that risk, as in these are the features or the capabilities within our application or the systems that are impacted by risk associated with this. And then I think the biggest thing, which AI would help with, is kind of that last question of, okay, well, you've told me that there is risk, you've told me what's impacted by that risk, you've told me the cause of that risk, but what do I do about that? Right. So being able to have AI suggest to say, this is what you can do to most efficiently reduce this risk. What are the tests that I need to run? What are the features that need to be reviewed? All of those, be able to suggest very succinctly, do this and you'll reduce your risk by this much. I think that's really where AI comes in. And again, AI can help with all of it.
I think you brought up something at the beginning of that answer that I hadn't really thought about before, is that this new generation coming into the workforce that are becoming AI native, right? And utilizing this, it's actually introducing a new level of risk because we've all experienced dealing with a large language model like a ChatGPT or a Bard or some of the other ones out there where it gives you bad information, right? With such confidence. But now you have people that are learning to do software development and are coming into the workforce utilizing these tools. Well, I think that makes code reviews much more important than they have been in the past. And the idea of multi-developer teaming development, because you have people that are frankly, they just don't have the experience yet to understand whether or not the suggested code that they got from this generative AI is actually bad code. Is it secure code, right? I mean, it's not just logically correct, but is it secure code? Was it written properly? How was that large language model trained, and was the training data good? I think that's a whole new level and layer of risk that's introducing into the workforce with that we in software development are going to have to figure out the best way to handle that. I don't have the answer to that, but the first part, I've had this conversation when I was talking about self-healing as well. The first step of healing is understanding that you have a problem, right? And recognizing that you have a problem. I think we've identified a problem here that will have to be addressed. So you've talked about using data to determine risk. So it kind of brings me up to, how do you ensure that that the risks that are being identified are truly objective risks versus subjective risks? So I started my career back in the 90s, way back in the 90s. Yes, I know, the last millennium. You make all the old comments that you want. That's fine. I don't mind. But the way we identified risks frequently, you would be in a meeting, in a project status meeting, and somebody who was intimately involved and knowledgeable about the business would be identifying risk, and it was really based on their knowledge that they had because of where they came from. We used to call that tribal knowledge, right? It was something that they knew because of their experiences. And it seemed to me sometimes the risk that someone would bring up, you could be sitting there and going, I don't understand how that could possibly be a risk, but sure, okay, you're the expert. How do we ensure that we're getting away from the subjective risk and really identifying objective risks? And I know you answered most of that question previously, but I just want to call it out.
No, that's a really important question, and some good points that you made there. I think a part of that is just the nature. I talked about it a little bit earlier. Is just the pure size and distributed characteristics of companies today. Is that we're massive. We're as people located all over the world. So there's differences, time differences, cultural differences, communication differences, just from a human perspective, that makes that really hard. And then from a subjective standpoint, that's really where, when I go in, and I've talked with a lot of companies and a lot of clients over the years, is that a lot of how they assess risk is subjective. It's that this person is an expert because they've been there for a long time, and they just know, right? They just know the areas of the application, right? They just know. And that can be a team or a person or a group of teams that just understand or just know where the risk is, where the risky parts of their application is, what the risky parts of what the impact of those things is. But again, that's not traceable. That's not repeatable. That's, people leave companies all the time. People forget things all the time. And especially with companies this large, right? Somebody could make a change that person doesn't know about. It could have an impact on whether or not that risk is the same or still associated in the same way that they knew. So while in a lot of cases that subjective risk is okay, it doesn't significantly reduce that risk. So if we can have a system to be able to categorize that risk, what type of risk is it? A system to be able to score and scale that risk, that we have consistent measurements and metrics to be able to score that risk, and then having that system that is able to clearly show what is the impact of this risk, what are the areas of our application, what are the features, what's the business impact to this risk, is crucial. And then I think, when we talked about things of AI, is then suggesting what are the things that you can most efficiently do to significantly reduce that risk is really, really important. So I think if, and that's objective, because we have this consistent scale, it's documented, it's easily reported upon. I can, do something along the lines of simply opening up a browser, viewing a dashboard, and seeing objectively where my risk lies, versus having to have stand-ups and email communication and Slack conversations about what's the risk of this if this fails, right? That's not a repeatable process. That's not a reportable process.
So you're kind of talking shameless self-plug here for Shifting Everywhere, the concept of shifting up that information, right? Shifting that up and making it visible to decision makers, right? Whether you want to call them management, you want to call it executives, executive leadership, whatever you want to call them, shifting that information up and making it visible for them. It's funny because you talk about that subjective risk. I mean, one of the first projects I was in IT, I came from the business. I worked in banking, and I got brought on into IT, and I was asked to estimate how long is it going to take for this change that was coming into one of our systems. And my estimate came back after doing some analysis and what I knew about the business. I'm like, this is going to take 28 days to make sure once the change is quote unquote ready, right? Air quotes again, ready. It's going to take us 28 days to verify that change was adequately put in. And people were going absolutely bananas over my estimate, and ended up taking 27 and a half days. And the reason was because there was a lot of knowledge that I had gotten from the business of that was back in the days where we did a lot of back end processing, nightly builds and batch processing and stuff like that, where you could only do so much, right? That the entire process to go from start to end for our data sets, it took 4 days, period. You couldn't do it faster than 4 days because of the way that things were coded and all that. So, it's just, but none of that was documented, right? You've talked about documentation that helps move it from subjective and individual person dependent to now a repeatable process and you're reducing actually the risk of somebody leaving. The saying of, what if I get hit by a truck? Well, okay, I like better, what if I win the lotto, right? I don't know how to tell you this, but if I were to win, the Powerball, the big jackpot of $300 million, when it's up that high, you may never hear from me again. I'm just telling you that right now, right? So how do you mitigate that kind of risk? So we're talked and we flowed a little bit into mitigation of risk. How does testing fit into mitigating risk? What does testing provide to mitigate these risks?
Well, I mean, let's break the term testing down to its simplest form. It's trying it out before we do it for real. Yeah. Right? So if we can go through all of those scenarios and be creative with those scenarios, that's going to be able to allow us to find and understand where that risk may lie. So not only is it going to potentially remove that risk, we can identify new areas of risk as well. And I think that's where collaboration, the term collaboration comes to mind when we talk about reducing risk through testing, is because we have to have, in order to do that well, we have to have multiple personas involved in that process of testing. it can't just be a test automation engineer that says, and I'm embellishing a bit, right? But that gets handed a number of manual steps and is said, okay, automate these. But it can't just be the person that comes up with those steps from the business, doing those steps manually. Because again, we talk about sheer size, sheer number of systems, applications, interdependencies, integrations. You have to build automation into that. So you have to have a technical skill set, but you also need to be able to have that person that truly knows the business process. So to have those personas come together and have that collaboration to say not only what are the most important things that need to be tested, but how can we most efficiently test those things is really important in mitigating that risk, because just sheer time is an element of risk, right? If everything is manual and there's no automation built into those things, that's introducing risk, because obviously we can't get through thousands of test cases for every change if we're doing all those things manually. So, when we talk about testing and reducing risk, I think that's where that collaboration term comes in for me as being really important, is that we have to have that collaboration, but we have to have a mechanism for that collaboration as well to be able to involve and have a consistent platform to be able to allow that business user, subject matter expert to be, in collaboration with that tester that has that technical skill set as well.
And I think that collaboration that you're talking about as well, you get to this diversity of thought that of how to test too. There are some of us out there that are at their core, they have this destructive mindset, right? That they're looking for how to break, right? A good tester, right? Good tester doesn't necessarily have to be a good automation person. In fact, a lot of times they're not, but a good tester has that destructive mindset. I'm going to, not because some of that can be learned, right? Some of that can be taught, how to do proper boundary testing, right? And if for those of you who don't know what boundary testing is, go Google it, right? But doing proper boundary testing. Oh, okay. Well, now, I think of a numeric field and I do boundary testing, right? So, okay. So it's a 3-digit field, right? So I'm going to do 0, I'm going to do 1, I'm going to do 999. Okay. I've done my boundary testing, right? And I might pick a value in the middle. But what about 1,000? What about pasting in 99 billion? What about pasting in -6? What about pasting in a poop emoji? What about pasting in, right? All these things that frankly could happen, right? People accidentally paste in, that they do. People do a lot of copy and paste nowadays, and people forget what's actually in their buffer, and they just paste something when they thought they didn't. They tried to hit Control C, they hit Control X instead, or Control Z instead, and now what they think's in their buffer isn't, and they paste in the wrong value, and the system blows up, right? Well, we as testers need to make sure that system doesn't blow up if it receives unexpected input. But that diversity of thought, as you worded it, collaboration is crucially important.
Mm-hmm. Well, so go ahead. That brings to mind something that one of the guys that mentored me earlier in my career that it always stuck with me. He said, if we could simplify it, get it in its most simplest form, that's the thought process difference between a developer and a tester. A developer says, make it work, make it work, make it work. A tester says, make sure it doesn't work. Make sure it doesn't work. Make sure we find out where it doesn't work so that we can fix it, so that a user doesn't find that, so that there's not a critical impact that is found in production. Let's find out where it doesn't work. That's a good point.
So you talked about automation being important, right? And absolutely critical for the speed of release that we have in a DevOps or an Agile world. One of the ways that you can speed up that automation is to do API testing, test at the API layer. And there's a lot of people who do a lot of their test automation at that API layer. Is that good enough? If I test all my APIs, is that good enough? And if not, why? So
I'd say it's better than nothing. It's certainly better than nothing. So sure. But certainly there's different nuances and context that applies to that. But generally speaking, no, because we can validate that a service replies with the correct data or not, but API testing and really even just pure UI functional testing can't tell you how a user is experiencing your application. It can't tell you what they see, what they experience, what they feel, even how what it makes the user feel and their interaction with the application. So there may be some cases where API testing is enough and certainly better than nothing, but it's only a fraction of the full scope of testing, right? It's not just API, it's not just UI. It's really important to understand how a user and different types of users and different types of personalities and cultures and backgrounds, like that all needs to be a focus when we look at testing in order to most significantly reduce risk.
So profiling your end user and making sure you do that. And I apologize, I broke one of our own cardinal rules here on application development today, right? I did not DYA, I did not define my acronym. Define your acronym. API, application programmer interface, UI, user interface. We talked about UX, user experience testing. So I apologize. I'm sure that the guys are going to love putting up visuals into this. The production guys are going to love being able to catch me on DWAY.
You led me astray. I didn't know that was a hard and fast rule.
Yeah. So how does that user experience testing differ though, right? So you talked about being able to, that we need to capture that, but how does that level of testing, user experience testing, differ from UI testing or API testing?
Yep. So again, when it's not just validating whether or not something works, right? It's not just that we want to make sure that when our application makes a REST call, that the data is populated correctly within the UI. That's certainly important. If that doesn't work, then it doesn't really matter what the user experience is like, because it just doesn't work. So that's certainly important, but it doesn't take into effect that human element. And that's so important because it doesn't matter how good your service is, whatever your good or service is that you're providing to your customer, it's if they don't have a positive experience with that service, it's going to, from a technology standpoint, it's going to impact their trust in your company, in your brand, in your service. It's going to affect their loyalty to your brand, to your company, to your service. So,
especially when you're talking about customer acquisition, which is one of the most expensive business ventures you can do, is customer acquisition. If your initial form of engagement has user experience problems, users in today's world will just abandon, right? There's so many competitors out there. You think about a banking application, right? If I am thinking about switching banks and I go check out this other bank and I get on their app and I try to register as a user so I can do it, and they have a gray background which is pleasing to the eye, and I type in my email address and it pops it in there, and it does it as white on a light gray background. Well, I can't even see that as a person. Now, functionally, that pass, right? That's a pass test functionally, right? The value came in, it was properly formatted, it was underscored because it's an email address, the value that I typed in showed up, pass, right? User experience, it's that the visual contrast isn't sufficient that it could pass, right? So that's a user experience defect. Now, me as a customer, as a potential customer, I see that. I can't even tell if they got my email address correct. I'm going to the next bank, right?
And you would be really surprised, talking specifically to the banking industry, you would be incredibly surprised around the metrics of how quickly people will leave a bank because of their mobile app. I
Sure,
was
yeah.
shocked when I saw those things. Even if your interest rates are better for your checking and savings accounts, rates for CDs are better, it doesn't matter. If they have a poor experience with the mobile app from a functionality standpoint, an experience standpoint, or even a performance standpoint, people bail altogether on a bank because of their experience in the mobile app. It was just really shocking to me.
Yeah, and one of the things that I did some research, and the metric that I had, and I'm not making this metric up, but it was 68% of people will spend more money on the brands that they trust, which is just rocks the mind to think about how important trust is when it comes, which user experience has a big is a big contributing factor to trust. If your user experience is bad, I don't trust them, right? If my user experience is good, 68% of people are willing to spend more money on that brand that they trust for the same product, same value that they get, just because they trust them more. So I can't emphasize user experience and testing the user experience enough.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
You brought up two things quickly there. One on the trust side as it relates to risk, and then the user experience side. 2 points I wanted to make there that you brought up. So one, generally speaking, when we talk about that user experience, we talk about trust, we talk about mitigating risk. It's trust is that's a part of life. Like, we want to be able to trust people, right? That's something that is a part of everyday life. But we don't necessarily want that to assume that risk and trust when it comes to software testing, right? Yeah. So we want to be able to assess every possible scenario, not just from a, like you talked about, API standpoint, not just from a functionality, from a UI standpoint, but that's really where we want to lower that risk as much as possible from a testing standpoint. Covering all those scenarios. So the one that when you talked about trust, that brought that to mind. But then from the example that you used of the gray background white text standpoint, that's actually something that brought to mind of our good friend Chris Tremper at Independent Health, and that brought that example to mind because they're using some of our AI capabilities and test automation there to automate their mobile app scenarios. So it brought to mind what he was sharing a few weeks ago on a call we had of they had automated a good portion of the cases that they needed to do within their mobile app. Then their mobile app development team came to them and said, "Hey, we're going to change the whole underlying development framework for a mobile app." And they said, "What's that mean to you?" And he said, "Well, are you going to change the flow? You can change the paths through the application in order to achieve
the user experience, right?
Right. Are you going to change those things?" No. Okay. Well, then that means absolutely nothing to me, right? So because he was using that AI capability, they made the development framework changes, and zero automation broke. It was, is incredible. Well, I wouldn't say quite zero because there were things that broke, but it was actually a good thing, right? It was a user experience thing that they found. And it was that exact example that you used of, there was like an email link or something to add your email or, click a link or something, but it was a light gray background and white text, and the automation broke because AI couldn't see it. And when you went and looked at it with your human eyes, you couldn't see it either. You couldn't make out what the text was. So it was, a user experience thing that because, Chris had that mindset of user experience and then had the technical capabilities with AI, was able to find things that traditional UI or API automation wouldn't have found. So I know I went a little on there, beyond there, but those two comments you made brought up those two examples.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as somebody who started, doing test automation in the 90s, and we kind of have gone down a little bit of a rabbit hole, which I'm fine with, but the ability for computer vision that computer vision brings into a test automation person's realm is absolutely groundbreaking. It's earth shattering to me, especially when I first saw it. I just went, wow, that's amazing. And then, the second part of that is of the computer vision is, I don't have to deal with the object properties anymore. That was, I just had to, my mind exploded. What do you mean I don't have to deal with object properties anymore? So Mason, thanks for taking the time today. I always give featured guests a chance for parting thoughts. Any parting thoughts, parting words of wisdom that you'd like to do? Mason, words of wisdom? And wow.
No real words of wisdom from me today, other than thanks for having me. Thanks for considering the little tiny bit of knowledge about not much that I have to be valuable enough to come on your podcast and talk about things like risk. I know I have conversations about this on a weekly basis with different customers, and it's certainly a topic of interest for every single one of them. How do we reduce risk as much as we possibly can? And the best way to do that is to be able to test efficiently, to test through different mindsets, both from a human element, but also from a technical element. So I think the more collaboration we talked about that you can provide there from a testing knowledge and application knowledge and business knowledge all together is, and then again, having that system of record to understand the impact of risk, categorizing that risk. Those things are really important to be able to do those things. So thanks again.
Absolutely. Thank you again for taking the time today. And tune into our next session where we're going to be talking about test data management in a modern DevOps, or maybe you're doing value stream management world. I'm looking forward to having that conversation. If you've done test data management in the past, we're going to be talking with a couple experts in the field about how has that changed with modern practices, or has it not changed, right? Are the rules still applicable? Do you still do it the same way or what? So I look forward to having that. And once again, Mason, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Yep. Thanks, Tom.
Have a great rest of your day.
You too.
If you liked the video, please click the like button. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that you get notified when we release new videos.